So we don't have the option as Christians to segment off different aspects of our lives and treat them completely differently. Instead, we must, as Christians, do our best to allow a biblical worldview to influence everything that we think about the world, including at the polls. Let's go ahead and get going with tonight's topic. 4 Christian principles for voting. A lot of people are talking about voting right now, and it's really, really important. Election year, people want to know how to vote. People want to know what the biblical standards for voting are. So we're going to be digging into that. I got 4 principles for voting tonight, guys. The first principle, Christians should be politically involved to some degree. And a lot of people like to say that Christians shouldn't be involved in politics at all, but I don't think that's biblical. Oftentimes they'll go to the verse that says, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's and render unto God what is God's. Or the verse where Jesus says, my kingdom is not of this world. But the fact of the matter is that we as Christians have a dual citizenship. We are both citizens of God's kingdom, Christ's kingdom spiritually, but we also have to be citizens of a worldly kingdom. And here in America, we are citizens of America. Just because our primary identity is to be found in Christ does not at all mean that we don't also have other identities. We also happen to be fathers and mothers and daughters and brothers and sisters and sons. And so we also happen to be citizens of the country in which we live. And because of that, we ought to participate in the countries in which we live to our best degree, okay? Just because it says render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, just because Jesus says his kingdom isn't of this world, doesn't mean that we shouldn't be involved in politics. And I think the closest verse to teaching us the truth on this subject comes from 1 Corinthians 10:31. So whether you eat or drink or whatever you do it all for the glory of God. Whatever you do, says Paul, do all of it to the glory of God. That you are not meant just to live for yourself. You're not meant to live just for your own purposes or will in your life, but instead you are seeking to live for God's glory in every area of your life. And this includes political life. This includes your earthly citizenship to the society in which you live, okay? That's an important idea. So we should be politically involved to some degree. Now, it's at this point that a lot of your common arguments come into play. A lot of people say something like this: not voting is casting a vote, but it is casting it for the winner implicitly. Or non-participation is participation in some sense. And I think this is true. Jesus said, if you are not with me, you're against me. If you do not gather with me, you scatter abroad. And I think the same principle comes into play in our lives here as citizens in America. We may choose not to vote, but that doesn't mean that we aren't implicitly impacting the society or the politics in which we live, okay? We're still impacting it. We're still having some sort of influence on it, even by not voting. So it's one of those things that you can't really opt out of, okay? Now, I'm not telling you have to vote, but Christians should be involved in politics to some degree. Now, this is also dependent upon your particular giftings and emphasis. Some Christians are meant to be more involved in politics than others, okay? Just because you're supposed to be involved in some degree doesn't mean you're supposed to be involved to the utmost extent like somebody else might be. You are at least called, however, to be a good citizen, to be somewhat familiar with the issues so that you can vote in good conscience. And I'm not telling you or forcing you to vote here. I'm not bringing that sort of messaging. But I am saying that even not voting is participating in some way, shape, or form. There's no neutrality when it comes to this stance. Non-participation is a participation, okay? So that's my first principle that I wanted to bring out. Christians should, in some way, shape, or form, be politically involved to some degree. But that degree is going to vary based upon your particular callings and giftings. Point number 2 that we need to recognize when it comes to voting is that issues are complex and involve a multitude of considerations, okay? And I've got a quote here from John Frame. He says this: candidate Mershon might have a better view of one issue than candidate Beets, while Beets has a better view on a different issue. It is an art to weigh the importance of different issues and come to a godly conclusion. Each of us should have a large amount of tolerance for other Christians who come to conclusions that are different from ours. I think this is a very key idea, guys. The fact of the matter is nobody comes at us as a monolith. It's not like one political party represents all of the things God cares about and the other political party represents all the things God doesn't care about. It's not as though one political party is obviously and straightforwardly for God, whereas another political party is obviously and straightforwardly against God. The fact of the matter is that with the two-party system we have here, you're never going to find a candidate that lines up 100% with all of those things that we want to support. And so you need to take each issue into consideration. You see, some issues you're going to find some candidates are really, really good on, and you want to vote for them. But then on a couple other issues, they're no good on. And then you have to start weighing which issues are more important. Does this issue make more sense to me than that one? Do I want to vote in line with this issue or this other one? This is the complexity that comes with voting because these candidates aren't monoliths that always agree 100% with God's standards or biblical standards. Unfortunately, that's just not how it works. And so you're going to have to consider those things. And because of that, we as Christians need to have tolerance and grace towards one another when we come to different conclusions on these issues. I do not think it is obvious and straightforward that you should always be voting red or you should always be voting blue, okay? I don't think that's obvious or straightforward, okay? The third issue I want to bring up is this, that voting often has to do with strategy or pragmatism. How effective do you think this candidate is likely to be on the issues that you care about? This is a pragmatic vote, or this is an issue of strategy. When we're voting, we need to recognize that although a candidate may have a strong stance on one issue, he may not be able to affect much change on that issue. And so while he strongly stands for it, it doesn't mean that pragmatically he's going to get much done about it. We need to recognize as voters that ultimately these things, the reasons we're voting for these figures is not because, first and foremost, of what they stand for, but instead for the policies they enact and the things they can actually get done. If you have a presidential candidate or some other candidate who stands strongly on an issue, but they're not going to be able to get much done in regards to it, then although it may be an important issue for you, it may not be a very good pragmatic or strategic vote. So you also need to consider that when it comes to the topics you're voting on. Okay, this is an issue of strategy. This is an issue of effectiveness. You're not just voting for the platform straightforwardly, but you're also voting for what are they going to realistically get done when it comes to their platform. Many candidates promise a lot, but ultimately don't get anything done on that platform. And you can have a little bit of foresight to see whether or not they're going to be able to accomplish anything when it comes to that issue. So you need to consider that. How likely is it that this candidate is going to be able to make a difference or make a change in the issues that you care about? Here's the deal. Your Christian worldview ought to impact how you vote. Your Christian worldview ought to change how you view things societally. A lot of people are fairly bifurcated in their mind. They're a Christian on Sunday. They're a Christian in the church. But ultimately, they don't take a lot of their Christian ideas or principles into the voting booth with them. Instead, when they're there, they use secular arguments. They use secular ideas. They don't think actively as a Christian. The Bible rules that out for us. We are to glorify and honor God in all areas of our life. We are to tear down spiritual strongholds and thought processes in high places and instead exalt Christ as our authority and standard in all areas of life. So we don't have the option as Christians to segment off different aspects of our lives and treat them completely differently. Instead, we must, as Christians, do our best to allow a biblical worldview to influence everything that we think about the world, including at the polls, including at the voting booth, okay? A very, very important thing. And it's at that point that you need to consider strategy. Zale says, does that go so far as to say those with less understanding should then abstain from voting? I don't know if I would go that far, Zale. I think even somebody with a lesser understanding could still make a positive contribution at the polls, but it's a very good consideration, right? We don't send new converts, for example, out into war, right? You don't send them out into battlefield, spiritual battle. By the same token, I don't know that we should be encouraging or sending those who aren't skilled in these areas out to the voting booths. It's a very good concern. But I don't think it takes much to get some good idea of the direction you should go, some good guidance in your mind. And I do think it might be okay to not vote. I do think that might be okay. I'm not taking a definitive stance that you have to vote. But ultimately, you have to ask yourself, practically speaking, strategically speaking, what are we actually getting done when we don't vote or when we do vote? Okay. And it's at that point that I would also like to say that there's often a consideration that you want to vote middle of the road. You want to vote third party. Well, let me tell you this. I know it's a common statement. Oftentimes, a vote for a third party is essentially wasting your vote. Now, I know a lot of people are offended by that. A lot of people are upset by that. But I'm just talking practically about the situation. Now, if in your conscience you can't vote red or blue, I've got no problem with you voting third party. It's ultimately your vote. Take all the considerations you have. But I do want this idea of strategy or tactics to be in your mind when it comes to voting. We're trying to get things done out in the political realm for God's glory, for the sake of the kingdom. And to do that, we need to have good considerations of all the policies that are at play and what can we do to honor and glorify God with our vote. Okay? So I do want to throw that out there. I'm not saying that voting third party is sin. I'm not saying that it's something that you can't do. You absolutely can. But consider that you are basically voting in such a way that your vote kind of doesn't count, right? Oftentimes, I think this is a key idea, oftentimes we must vote for the lesser of two evils. Oftentimes we're doing that, okay? And you need to recognize that when you're voting for somebody who's going to actually go out and attempt to get things done strategically in the political sphere. And oftentimes, that might be voting for the lesser of two evils, thinking that on the issues you really care about, they stand for what you stand for. And on the issues where you disagree with them, they're not going to change much in terms of policy. That's a decent idea or approach, okay? Marin says, what I don't get is my friends who vote for a candidate and from their speech and writing seems to raise the candidate to the level of idolatry. They're professed Christians too. Been a stressful, confusing few months. I completely understand, Marin. And we definitely need to recognize that our vote, we do not put our trust in worldly leaders. We do not put our trust in the president, right? The Bible says, do not put your trust in princes, but instead trust in God. We need to recognize that. That doesn't mean we abdicate our human responsibility to try and vote and to actually influence and impact the world for Christianity, but it does mean that we're not putting all of our hope, trust, and desire in these candidates. Ultimately, they're going to fail us. We are not delivered by Trump or Biden. We are delivered by God, and that requires repentance and faith. We must turn to God ultimately when it comes to these topics. Very good point, Marin. Lafayette says, it's also practical to leave one or more blank on a ballot if need be. For some reason, this is a lost concept in this country. Very good point, Lafayette. You can absolutely on a ballot decide, I'm not going to vote for these positions or for either of these candidates. Again, you can vote third party, perhaps, but to me, that's more of a vote according to your conscience, not a vote according to strategy, okay? And I do think we as Christians ought to vote strategically. Okay, let me go to my fourth point now. Well, no, on the topic of effectiveness, I actually want to go to a tweet from Timothy Keller. This is a tweet from Timothy Keller, and he caught a lot of flack for this, but I think it's relevant to what we're talking about, okay? So listen to this. This is Timothy Keller, and I agree with him broadly, and the issue that he caught a lot of flack for, I'm going to talk about right after this, okay? Timothy Keller says this. Christians and the freedom of conscience in politics. The Bible binds my conscience to care for the poor, but it does not tell me the best practical way to do it. Remember I said this is about strategy? This is about tactics? This is about pragmatics? Exactly right. The Bible bonds my conscience to care for the poor, but it does not tell me the best practical way to do it. Any particular strategy, high taxes and government services versus low taxes and private charity, may be good and wise. And I love what he's saying here. He says, look, we need to care for the poor. Now, there are two approaches to that. The first one he lists is the common blue approach. The second approach he lists is the common red approach, okay? There are two approaches, and what he says is now we're on the realm of strategy. Now we're on the realm of pragmatics. He continues, and may even be somewhat inferred from other things the Bible teaches, but they are not directly commanded, and therefore we cannot insist that all Christians, as a matter of conscience, follow one or the other. The Bible binds my conscience to love the immigrant, but it doesn't tell me how many legal immigrants to admit to the U.S. every year. It does not exactly prescribe immigration policy. The current political parties offer a potpourri of different positions on these and many other topics, most of which, as noted, the Bible does not speak to directly. This means when it comes to taking political positions, voting, determining alliances, and political involvement, the Christian has liberty of conscience. Christians cannot say to other Christians, no Christian can vote for ... or every Christian must vote for ... unless you can find a biblical command to that effect. End quote. What Keller is getting at here is strategy. Keller is getting at tactics, because we need to try and figure out, as fallen human beings, how best to fulfill these biblical commands and mandates. We are going to disagree sometimes when it comes to how to practically do these things in the real world, okay? And that's what Keller is getting at. Now, he did catch some flack for this, and I'm going to tell you why here in a second, but I think his large principle stands, and I agree with it, okay? We are talking on the topic of tactics and strategy, and on that topic, we must not say, you as a Christian must vote this way, or you as a Christian must not vote that way, okay? Final idea, point number 4. Some issues hold more weight than others. We need to recognize this, okay, guys? We need to recognize this. It isn't just this candidate holds my stance on 3 issues or my stance on 4 issues. It's some issues hold more weight than others. And I'm going to read another quote from John Frame here, okay? This is from John Frame. In general, single-issue voting is a bad thing. Don't vote for just one issue. We should weigh all the programs and policies of parties and candidates before deciding whom to vote for. But some issues are so serious that they dominate all others. For me, abortion is such an issue, and it is one issue that keeps me voting on the conservative side. Okay? This is a key idea that I want us to see. The reason Timothy Keller caught so much flack for the tweet we read is because so many people said, you're completely ignoring the issue of abortion, okay? You're completely ignoring the issue of abortion. And I do think he was kind of downplaying it and minimizing it. You saw he brought up immigration. You saw he brought up, principles of caring for the poor, but he didn't say anything about abortion. And the fact of the matter is, abortion is, from any biblical reading, a horrible evil that we ought not to encourage or promote. And so you can see here, Frame recognizes some issues are more important than others. And one very, very important issue is abortion. We need to make that to have more weight in our mind when it comes to voting for certain candidates. Now, I'm not done yet, so don't get up in arms, because this is also the case. Frame says this, but from a biblical standpoint, the care of the poor is nearly as important. And that's 100% true. Caring for the poor, the downtrodden, and the needy is something the Bible speaks on heavily, repeatedly, and it doesn't let up on. And so it might be just as important, or at least nearly important. He continues, I think it is somewhat less important than abortion because abortion is literally a matter of life and death. As I indicated in chapter 37, unborn children are the most helpless of citizens, what we may now call the poorest of the poor, and they are being killed, not merely oppressed or neglected. So that's why he says abortion's a little bit worse to him, or holds a little bit more weight to him than neglect of the poor. We recall that Mother Teresa not only championed care for the poorest, but also, to the distress of some of her supporters, care for the unborn. These concerns proceeded from the same ethical impulse. But we must also be concerned about those who have survived into infancy and have remained poor. Abortion, very, very important issue, and it should hold a lot of weight for how we're voting, okay? And so that should cause you to lean in the direction of voting red. But care for the poor, lifting them up, that's something that biblically is very, very important. And so that issue should cause you to lean a little bit blue, a little bit in the blue direction. Where are we now? We're in the area of strategy and tactics. Which candidate that you vote for is more likely to do more good than harm? Which candidate is more likely to do less evil? Those are the questions you have to ask yourself. If you vote for a blue candidate, are they likely to get much done in terms of promoting abortion in this country? Maybe, maybe not. If you vote red, are they likely to get much done in terms of caring for the poor? Maybe, maybe not. There is also a point to be made from the right side or the red side that we ought not to be outsourcing care for the poor to the government. We ought not to be socializing in that sense, but we should more be a republic or a democratic republic. And we should rely on private charity from organizations rather than the government to support these areas. But you see where we're at now? Now we're talking about strategy. Now we're talking about tactics. Now we're talking about implementation. And that's going to come down to different arguments and different ideas, okay? Lone Wolf says, so you're talking that all parts of our lives should be intertwined around our core biblical beliefs all the time. Exactly right, Lone Wolf. Exactly right. Everything that we do in our lives, our vocation, our jobs as fathers or mothers, daughters or sons, all of that should be wrapped up with our biblical identity, including whether or not we're voting red or blue or independent. This is the last thing I want to go into. I said, Frame says, for me, abortion is such an issue, and it is one issue that keeps me voting on the conservative side. Okay, I can see that. But I want Frame to bring or bear in mind the fact of strategy or tactics. Again, I do not think that we should vote for an issue as a matter of principle necessarily. I don't like that idea. I think that we should vote for issues as a matter of pragmatics. What is actually going to happen or get done? I can understand somebody wanting to vote on principle for the sake of conscience. I'm not going to condemn you for that. But ultimately, I want to ask myself, practically speaking, what is this candidate going to get done for good or for evil? Practically speaking, what are they going to accomplish in their tenure? And so you can see John Frame says, I keep voting red because abortion is such an important issue. Well, when it comes down to pragmatics, I've got a graph for John Frame, okay? And I love John Frame. He was a professor at my seminary. Check this graph out, guys. This is number of abortions per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44 by year from the inception of Roe v. Wade, 1973. And you can see it is colored by the administration. Was it a Democratic administration or a Republican administration? Let's look at the stats. First of all, note that from 1973 to 1981, abortion rates were climbing as a result of Roe v. Wade, okay? It topped out here at close to 30 abortions per 1,000 women aged 15 to 44 years. And then it began to fall and has essentially been falling ever since. Now, what you're looking for here is how fast is it falling? How fast is it falling? And you can see here from the Republican side, it falls, but when we hit Democratic administrations, it seems to fall more quickly. You can't argue with data, guys. You can't argue with statistics, okay? Now, I would expect if voting for Obama automatically led to more abortions, I would expect that these numbers would climb during blue administrations and drop during red administrations. But it's not at all what we see. Instead, we see it dropping during all administrations, and it looks to me like it falls more quickly during Democratic administrations. That's at least what the data shows. Now, don't get me wrong. If you know anything about statistics, this isn't a very large sample size, and it's not, very definitive. But the fact of the matter is, if you want to vote for red because you think abortion is a moral evil and you can never support it, recognize you're voting on principle, not on statistics. You're voting on the principle of the matter, not on the actual data that we're seeing. I think that sometimes when you're voting for somebody, you need to consider what are they going to accomplish for good and for evil. And you need to consider what they're going to get done. Now, I want you to know I presented all these statistics. I, because of my conscience, very much struggle to vote blue. Okay? I very much struggle to vote blue. And while the care for the poor is very, very important, I do think that we should be trying to do that privately. Okay? We should be trying to advocate for care for the poor privately. Okay? I don't like farming that out to the government. I generally believe in smaller government, not bigger government. So you can see I lean conservative. Okay, you can see I lean more towards a libertarian type of side. We've talked economics on this channel before. I tend to lean towards a trickle-down economics or something like that. We've talked about those things before, but I can't ignore the data, okay? The data is clear. Abortion is falling during both types of administrations, and although it's a small sample size, it seems to fall a little more rapidly during blue administrations. You can't argue with the data. So if you're going to vote red just because of abortion, recognize you're voting on principle, not on pragmatics. Okay? You're voting on principle, not on pragmatics. So I will review the 4 points. Christians should be politically involved to some degree. We need to take every thought captive and bring it into submission to Christ. We need to do that in every area. Okay? Second, issues are complex and involve a multitude of considerations. You don't just have a monolithic party that stands for God while other parties do not, okay? Third, how effective do you think this candidate is going to be on the issues you care about? Talking about strategy and tactics, pragmatically. And fourth, recognize some issues hold more weight than others, primarily the issues of abortion and the issues of care for the poor. Some issues hold more weight than others. Abortion and care for the poor are two such issues, okay? We're going to bring up Doctrine of the Christian Life by John Frame to go into the issue. I tend to vote for conservative candidates, he says, because conservatives tend to have more respect for Christianity than do liberals. And I honestly believe that free enterprise is better for the poor, on the whole, than is a government management of human welfare. In the last section, however, I argued that government welfare is not wrong in all situations. We already read that. And in some cases, at least, can be defended. So I do not believe that the government involvement in welfare is wrong per se. And if I believed that a liberal government program would improve the condition of the poor, that would go a long way towards persuading me to vote accordingly. You hear that? We shouldn't just be like, I'm conservative. Capitalism all the way. No, if it can be demonstrated, if there is data to support the idea that a liberal government program improves the condition of the poor, then, hey, we should be open to that. We should want the poor to do well. And we should be open to talking about and discussing it. And are there ways that we can improve their condition? The issue is empirical and pragmatic more than specifically theological. Does a particular political system seem to help the poor? If that program is in accord with generally biblical view on the scope of government, then it may well deserve the support of Christian voters. Boom. That's what we need to ask. That's what we need to ask. Does a particular political program seem to help the poor? If that program is in accord with generally biblical view of the scope of government, then it may well deserve the support of Christian voters. Pundits and politicians, even Christian writers, often assume that anyone who cares for the poor will vote liberal. I do not believe that argument is fair, but the issue is important, perhaps one of the most important. We should not equate the scriptures with any political program, but as Christians determine who to vote for, the issue of poverty should be one of their central concerns. Boom. Like I said, when it comes to your voting, we talked about this already on the topic of voting, but when it comes to voting, two key concepts, two key ideas should be at the forefront of your mind. Will this candidate worsen the state of abortion in this country? Will this candidate worsen the state of the poor in this country? Both of those should be at the forefront of your mind. Those are our top two concerns, as far as I can tell, from biblical principles. Those should really govern how you vote in the polls. I will say this as well. You ought to consider the issue of socialism versus capitalism when you vote, because you can see the left is leaning more and more in the direction of socialism. So that needs to be a primary issue you think of as well. The poor, abortion, capitalism versus socialism. All of those need to be considered as we go to the polls this year. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed that content. If you want to go deeper with us, please head down to the description, hit up the links to Twitch and Discord, where you can be part of this awesome community that we're building and be part of the discipleship that we're growing with together. Also, if you would consider hitting like and subscribe, we'd really appreciate it. Take care. God bless. Bye now.